I'm Peter Curran, Head of Invest NI's Dual Market Access Unit, and I'm joined today by Kevin Shakespeare from the Chartered Institute of Export and International Trade. What I'd like to do during this discussion is to determine how trade in goods has changed for GB and EU companies doing business with each other since the UK left the EU single market. I'd then like to compare that to how Northern Ireland goods are traded with both GB and the EU, again in the post-EU exit era. Kevin, perhaps just to start with, you could maybe give a brief introduction to the Chartered Institute of Export and International Trade and your role within it.
Thank you, Peter. So the Chartered Institute of Export and International Trade, established in 1935, we are a registered charity. We're very much here to support the whole trade, export, supply chain, logistics community. We are regulated to deliver professional qualifications by regulators in England, Wales and Northern Ireland and Scotland. And we deliver in Northern Ireland qualifications through the colleges and the universities. So very much we're here to support the whole Northern Ireland business community, whether that's trade intra-Northern Ireland, with Ireland, the rest of the European Union, Great Britain and the rest of the world.
Thank you. And if we cast our minds back, the UK left the European Union back on the 31st of January 2020. And for the next 11 months, the status quo effectively remained during what we know of as the transition period. So what changed for trade in goods for both GB and EU companies immediately after that transition period?
Yeah, obviously it was a few years ago, but really businesses are still feeling the impact of a change. And the main change was that previously the UK and the European Union were part of a single customs union, a single market, sometimes referred to as a common market. So there were no barriers to trade beforehand. You could move goods freely in free circulation across the whole of what was the European Union with the UK as part of it. What has changed predominantly now is that customs declarations are required, and that's not just one but two customs declarations. So for example, goods leaving Great Britain and you need an export declaration for goods arriving in the European Union. Using that example, you would need an import declaration, but it's not just the actual declarations itself and what's required. There's a documentation, the paperwork behind it, and then there's a need for compliance with what's in the declaration, the likes of classification of goods, origin of goods, valuation of goods as well. So there's been quite considerable changes there. For businesses in Northern Ireland, which I'm sure we'll get to talk about, those changes are considerably less, and very much the impact has been on businesses from GB exporting to the European Union and from businesses from the European Union exporting to Great Britain.
And what did all those changes mean for GB and EU companies trading with each other?
Effectively increase the cost of doing business. So customs declarations cost money, extra documentation costs money, more resource needed in businesses. So it really contributed to increase the actual costs of trade between the business, and consequently we have seen a bit of drop off in trade as small businesses especially struggle to meet those increased costs of trade.
And then the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, it was agreed on Christmas Eve 2020 and came into effect 8 days later on the 1st of January 2021. And I'd just like to confirm a couple of points around that agreement. First of all, even with the free trade agreement, customs procedures still apply?
That's correct, absolutely. And it's only if you're part of a customs union that customs procedures declarations would not apply.
And at the time, it was very much hailed as a zero tariff agreement, but that's not strictly the case. There are certain instances when tariffs do apply.
Absolutely, yes. So the headline agreement, as you said, was zero tariffs. But for zero tariffs to apply in any trade agreement, including the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, you have to meet complex requirements around rules of origin. So origin is effectively the economic nationality of the goods where they originate from. So if you have a circumstances where goods in the European Union or in Great Britain are not solely originating, then they have to be subject to what we call substantial transformation. There has to be a process, for example, a manufacturing production process there. So in a lot of cases where you have, for example, Chinese content, US content, it's difficult to meet the actual origin requirements of either being from the European Union or from Great Britain. So consequently, not all goods will be zero origin. And also to prove origin, you have to have evidence as well.
So we had moved from not needing any customs procedures to documentation required, maybe tariffs needed for trade between GB and the EU. What then did it mean in terms of the regulatory environment where there used to be one set of regulations for all?
Yeah, it really has meant there's been regulatory divergence. And that divergence is obviously customs is one element of it, but there's also the likes of packaging, labelling, what we refer to as technical barriers to trade, market access barriers. So in increased requirements. So again, for example, on sanitary and phytosanitary goods, food and drink, you need export health certificates, you need phytosanitary certificates for plant-based products, and so that divergence is a key element as well. And to take it a stage further for sanitary and phytosanitary goods, you need a food business operator in the European Union if you're exporting from Great Britain as well, and that food business operator is effectively the importer of record, and they're responsible for bringing those goods into the EU market. So we can see here there's extra actors, certification agencies in the supply chain, which in turn increase the cost further. But also I think a really good point you've made was around the compliance angle. Compliance is a key element, and we don't always think of compliance when we're moving goods across border, but that's been a key impact post-Brexit.
And I read an article recently which quoted that just under 20% of GB goods that are moving to the EU are subject to tariffs. Is that a reasonable percentage where a free trade agreement is in place, or do you think it should be less or more?
I'd like to think it'd be less, but what I think is it really shows the level of integrated supply chains that existed from the UK, Great Britain especially, to the European Union. So in some supply chains, in automotive manufacturing, the goods can literally cross the border between Great Britain and the EU 2 or 3 times in a complex supply chain. So that level of integration of supply chain makes it very difficult. And when you take it a stage further in the context of the amount of, say, Chinese imports that we have in the UK, Great Britain, it means that it's very difficult to prove the origin. So 20% just under sounds about right, just because we have been quite reliant on the likes of Chinese supply chains from Vietnam, for example, which makes it very, very difficult to actually claim origin and meet the requirements of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement.
Let's talk now for a moment on how goods that are in free circulation in Northern Ireland move both to Great Britain and the EU. As you know, goods in Northern Ireland are treated differently as part of the withdrawal agreement reached between the UK and the EU and then the subsequent Windsor Framework Agreement. Northern Ireland continues to access both markets freely, much as it did when the UK was a member of the EU. What do you see as the benefits of what we call here dual market access?
There are considerable benefits, and clearly it's going to differ each company in terms of what your goods are, what level of manufacturing or production is on those goods. But the headline benefit and the reality benefit is a business in Northern Ireland, or a business looking to invest or trade in Northern Ireland and set their supply chains up, has access to both the Great Britain market, England, Scotland, Wales, and the European market as well, which obviously includes Ireland. So that gives huge benefits for that business, and it also it gives a benefit of being 2 parts of a supply chain, both receiving the goods So whether goods are coming from the European Union to Northern Ireland or receiving the goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, and then sort of moving them on, especially if there's a production process. And I think that's an important element as well, is that element of advanced manufacturing production is really, really key. The more value you add, the more that you can transform origin as well of the goods to meet the requirements to effectively create this NI-based origin. So really, really big opportunity to access two markets, and clearly one of those markets includes south of the border Ireland, but also the huge market of Great Britain. So Northern Ireland businesses have a huge opportunity there to really be well placed.
And how do you think Northern Ireland's position compares with that of Great Britain and the European Union?
It compares favourably in that if you're a business in Great Britain, if you're part of supply chains, if you're receiving goods, you've still got all these barriers we've talked around, the customs, the divergence, the extra documentation. And if you're supplying goods out to the European Union, you've still got those barriers as well. And clearly, if you're a business in the EU, you've still got those barriers. So it really does give Northern Ireland a competitive advantage in a couple of ways. One is the costs of doing business, also the time to do business as well. The time to trade should be reduced without the additional checks at the border, so to speak, and also the ability to create supply chains as well based around Northern Ireland in different sectors.
Could we delve briefly now into what dual market access means from a regulatory perspective for Northern Ireland manufacturers? What do you see as the advantages in that area?
Yeah, there's quite a few advantages there. We can classify it obviously regulatory as more technical barriers to trade. So things like certification marks really is again a potential advantage to Northern Ireland. The fact that Northern Ireland products shouldn't have the same level of potential barriers when trading with the European Union, and similarly, if you're an EU business trading with Northern Ireland, less barriers when trading with Great Britain as well. So some of the markings, some of the packaging and labelling requirements, if you like, what's called third country differences, are effectively removed in the process as well.
And what sectors do you feel should benefit more, if any, from dual market access?
I would probably say across all sectors, and I guess we think of Northern Ireland, we obviously think of manufacturing being big, we think of food supply chains being big, so and also life sciences as well. If we think about medical devices, life sciences, those further opportunities and some of the regulatory requirements that are really needed in those sectors, Northern Ireland doesn't necessarily have those barriers in the same way as businesses in the European Union and Great Britain would have. So thinking a bit more about manufacturing, you'll have the likes of food manufacturing, machinery and transport, which again is clearly big for Northern Ireland, electrical goods, engineering goods, aerospace and defence, and clearly aerospace and defence in the world in which we live in is a sort of huge aspect at the moment. You think of the UK part of the wider AUKUS agreement with the United States, Australia, some of the agreements that the UK has with Italy as well on trade and defence, the whole sanctions environment. It does potentially put Northern Ireland in a good position, but it's about positioning itself in that supply chain.
And when I go out and talk to companies here, a lot of them will say that nothing has really changed since the UK left the European Union. What's your view on that, or what would you say to companies that would say that to you?
I think there's two ways of looking at it. One is you could say, well, nothing has really changed. That's one way of looking at it. I think the other way of looking at it is to look at it as an opportunity, because little has changed from a Northern Ireland perspective. That gives opportunities compared with the EU and GB businesses. What has changed is that advantage in itself, and it's trying to turn that into an advantage in terms of thinking about your business, what your business does, whether you're based in life sciences, in the manufacturing manufacturing sector, in the food sector, because all those are quite highly regulated. We have what we call controlled goods as opposed to standard goods. So a lot of those products are controlled goods, which when you move within a single market and a customs union, you don't have those barriers.
And if we look at the Northern Ireland economy here, it's made up primarily of small and medium-sized enterprises, many of which are sole traders. And a lot of those sole traders are also trading across the border from Northern Ireland into the Republic of Ireland. What bit of advice would you give to them if they wanted to grow their business and perhaps enter new markets?
I think with any new market, you tend to choose a market that's near to you. Both logistically, geographically, where there's potentially similar culture as well. So trading into the Republic, and clearly that there has been a big growth in trade with businesses in the Republic of Ireland, is a really good place to start. There are no barriers to trade, as we've talked around, and there are cultural differences, and there's also integrated supply chains as well, which is a really, really important aspect. And then there's the opportunity for trade with Great Britain. So we mustn't ever forget the huge opportunity on trade with Great Britain, and also think about the actual trade routes as well, whether it's Liverpool, whether it's Cairnryan for Glasgow and so on, is there's big opportunities for that trade within Great Britain, and there's very well established trade logistics routes that can apply. Then once you've got trade with Ireland, you can then think about trade with the rest of Europe, but you still have opportunities to trade direct from Northern Ireland with likes of Netherlands, Belgium, France and Germany, for example.
So EU very much a target, or should be a target for growing exports after you've dealt with trading across the border in the Republic of Ireland, and also not forgetting the opportunities that exist, of course, in Great Britain.
Yeah.
And finally, as you would expect, I look at stats from time to time, and the HMRC stats that came out actually recently up to the end of 2024. For the second year in a row, both in 2023 and in 2024 again, Northern Ireland was the only UK region which grew its manufacturing exports to the EU. How important do you think was dual market access in Northern Ireland's ability to continue growing its exports to the EU?
I would say huge. And so both in terms of a direct B2B sale, to a business end user, but also as part of supply chain. So dual market access to me has been hugely important there. And as I say, when we think about the EU, we got to think as well that being part of wider supply chains, to actually sell to tier ones, to OEMs, is hugely important as well, because a lot of the goods, for example, from Germany will then be onward sold to Canada, to United States and Japan, for example. So part of dual market access is absolutely key to achieve that, not just to the benefits to sell into Republic of Ireland, to Great Britain, to the European Union, but also the rest of the world as well, because supply chains are just so integrated, especially perhaps a manufacturing supply chains, the likes of aerospace, defence, engineering. Huge opportunities there to be part of big supply chains. And some of those big supply chains could be around the port of Rotterdam, the port of Antwerp, for example. You've got big warehousing, logistics companies there. So really thinking about those aspects in their entirety, both for sales direct to the European Union, but then part of wider supply chains. And I've always said the best export, the best sales business is your first. If you can get it right first time, you've got a wonderful opportunity for repeat business, and then you've got the onward sale opportunity as well.
That's been great, Kevin. Thank you very much for joining me today and highlighting the differences that exist and the benefits that we have here in Northern Ireland and the ability to trade as we did largely prior to EU exit for goods to both Great Britain and the EU. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.